is right here. We are right here between the hills, the stars, the sky, the river so clear, river so clear.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the home of Unitarian Universalism in Bismarck, Mandan. We're so happy to see you here this morning, the royal we. I am so happy to see you here this morning. Unitarian Universalism is a place where we celebrate diversity of beliefs and are guided by 7 principles, and you can find those in your order of service and, of course, on our website. As we gather here this morning, we acknowledge that we're in a place with a long history. We are in a place where Inueta, Hidatsa, Sanish, Dakota, Lakota, Tsitsias, Métis, and Anishinaabe peoples all claim belonging, connection, and deep knowledge. In recognizing all our relatives here, human and more than human, may we honor who and where we are today and find a way to be in right relationship with each other. This congregation is a place where we gather to nurture one another, to be supported in our life journey, and to put our beliefs into action through work in our communities and the wider world. My name is Marnie Peel, and I am active in the Growing and Deepening Council, and I'll be facilitating today's service. All right, so let's gather ourselves and get present here with some opening words. Let's join in a spirit of meditation, reflection, or prayer as we deepen into our service. I'll share our opening words this morning, and this reading comes from our gray hymnal. It's number 435 and is written by Kathleen McTeague. We come together this morning to remind one another to rest for a moment on the forming edge of our lives, to resist the headlong tumble into the next moment until we claim for ourselves awareness and gratitude, taking the time to look into one another's faces and see their communion, the reflection of our own eyes. This house of laughter and silence, memory and hope is hallowed by our presence together. All right, and now we'll move into our chalice lighting. It's an important part of our service. We join Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists all over the world in lighting our chalice. Mary Wilson, would you be so kind as to come forward to light the chalice? Thank you. The chalice is a symbol of the spark of life in each of us. If you're on Zoom and have your chalice with you, I invite you to turn on your video and share as we light them. Lighting this chalice together, we are in good company. Our chalice lighting words today are A Spark of Hope by Melanie Davis. If ever there were a time for a candle in the darkness, this would be it. Using a spark of hope, kindle the flame of love, ignite the light of peace, and feed the flame of justice.
Sun, my sail, and moon, my rudder, as I ply the starry sea, leaning over the edge in wonder, casting questions into the deep, drifting here with my ship's companions, all we kindred pilgrim souls, making our way by the lights of the heavens in our beautiful blue boat home. I give thanks to the waves upholding me, hail the great winds urging me on, greet the infinite sea before me, sing the sky my sailor's song. I was born upon the fathoms, never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home.
It is, but if you are a child or a child at heart or somebody who just loves children's stories, it'll be on that screen, and we can all take a moment to watch the story for all ages.
Today the bookworms are going to be reading From Far Away, story by Robert Munch and Sausen Asghar, art by Rebecca Green. The place we used to live was very nice, but then a war started. There's no food, my father said. We are getting shot at, my mother said. Bombs made holes in the wall. One day, a really big boom made our roof fall in. We have to leave, my father and mother said. My father left first and was gone for a long time. Then a letter came with plane tickets to a new country. I didn't like the plane. It made me sick. Nobody wanted to sit near me. In the new country, my father took me to school and left me there. He said, "Be good and listen to your teacher." I listened to my teacher, only I didn't know what she was saying because she did not talk right. Other kids tried to talk to me, but I was not able to answer. I didn't speak English. I had a buddy who showed me the school and played with me at recess, but she didn't understand when I tried to teach her a rock game I knew from back home. At first, I didn't know how to say, "I want to go to the washroom," so I crawled up the door when the teacher wasn't looking. When I came back, I waited outside the door until someone opened it. Then I crawled back to my desk. Once, I crawled to the washroom and saw a paper skeleton in the hallway. Only I did not know what it was. I thought the skeleton was evil. I thought that people were going to start shooting each other here. I screamed a very good scream. Everybody came running. They thought someone was being killed in the bathroom. My teacher tried to tell me that the skeleton wasn't real. It was made of paper and was going to be used in the school play. I didn't understand. She jumped up and down and danced around to explain that the play was just for fun. But I thought the skeleton made her crazy, and I screamed louder. Ah! My teacher hugged me, just like my mother would. I didn't know how to say, "I'm so scared," but the big tear that went out of my eye said it for me. I decided that the whole school was crazy, and I did not want to stay there. But my father said I had to. He said that people here are not going to start shooting each other. I had better dreams about skeletons for a long time after that, but finally I began to talk little by little. I learned enough English to make friends, and school started to be fun. Now I am in grade 2, and I'm the best reader and speller in the class. I read and write a lot of stories. The teacher is now complaining that I'm never quiet. So far, my favorite part of grade 2 is the trip our class took to the zoo. We got to see the pandas and monkeys and eat pizza, and nobody shot at us the whole time. I decided that my new country is a nice place. I changed my name from Sausen to Susan, but my mother told me to change it back. My teacher moved from our school. I saw her in the mall once and ran to her and hugged her. She was my first teacher in this country, and she helped me a lot.
Today, our program is titled Dina Butcher, A Conversation About Democracy and the Holocaust. In the spirit of full disclosure, Dina is my mother. So we will be sitting in the front of the room talking a little bit today as she does an overview of what we'll be talking about. But then we really want to make sure that this program is open to all of you too. We want this to be a conversation. We have time. We scheduled things that way so we would have time to talk and to share some reflections ourselves. So just an overview is that Dina Butcher's parents fled Nazi Germany in 1939 after her father was released from the notorious Sachsenhausen Concentration Camp in Germany. Many in her family were murdered in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. In recent years, Dina has been telling her family's tragic story and warning against the possibility of similar atrocities. And so now, Dina Butcher.
story for all ages reminded me of my, as I will tell in the chronological part of my story. My brother was only 2 when they arrived on these shores. And of course, he only spoke German. And he looked around at all the people who were jabbering at him and he said, "Are they verrückt? Are they crazy?" So that I identified that story with that lovely little story that was told. But it also crossed my mind when I saw Betty Mills here that I'm guessing that book will be censored under critical race theory guidelines that are coming at us, just like in I guess it was the 80s, Betty, when it was all the censorship of the libraries are trying for that. But anyway, back to my story, which does connect to these kinds of things. I was born in this country. I was born in September 1940. That's a side story that I can tell you sometime, because we don't all know about our conception, but I do. Anyway, my father was Jewish. His name was Siegbert Schoenthal. My mother was a Christian family, and her name was Margaret Vienna. They married in 1932 after 7 years of courtship. My father took over his family farm when his father committed suicide in 1927 because of the hard times in Germany, and he felt some of the racial issues that were coming forward. But he was also obviously was depressed, and people didn't recognize those things. But anyway, my father and mother courted for 7 years before they got married due to those kinds of circumstances. And her family was going through difficulties. Her stepfather had been killed in the First World War. Her mother died shortly thereafter. She was kind of the only responsible relative, and was trying to launch her brothers and sister. So there's the sad story of their getting together, but in 1932 they did get married, and that was before the Nuremberg laws were passed, which would have made that illegal, because the Nuremberg laws, which were passed in 1935, said that no Jew could marry someone who was a non-Jew. Plus, the other part of that, my brothers and sisters would have been illegitimate, or as they called them, they wouldn't be reine Rasse, but I'm not hitting on the word right now, Mischlinge, which is mixed race. Because that too was forbidden in the Nuremberg laws. Jews could not have sex with anyone who was a non-Jew, or vice versa. So just a few of the restrictions that were imposed by a government that had been a democracy. Hitler was not, it wasn't a coup. He had been put in jail previously in Austria because he tried to overthrow the government illegally and was put in prison. But he got to Germany and he managed to get his party in a position so that they took over in a democratic country in a democratic way, because the seeds were planted after the First World War. But long before that, if you read the history, there has always been a seed of the hatred of others in the psyche of the Germans. And I found the word, it's Volks, which I'm having a hard time, it must be too early and not enough coffee this morning. But there's a term, and it's Volkisch with the umlaut over the O, that has existed in not just Germany, in a lot of countries where there is a populism, and it gets tied into the religious fiber of the country. And that's what we may be able to see here right now, is that it ties this bias, and it's a religious bias, into the whole story of religion, Christianity, etc. But that's too deep to go into this morning. But I did find that concept since I've been telling this story. But how many of you watched the Ken Burns Holocaust the 3 segments of the Holocaust? Because if you have not watched Ken Burns, please do, because those 3 movies, well, 3 Sundays that they ran it, and they're running it over and over again, is so telling and gives this history of how the Holocaust came about. One of the most cultural bastions in the world. I mean, Germany produced Goethe and Mozart and just poets, Rilke, and just wonderful, wonderful cultural, and many of them were Jews, which is what is so tragic about all this, because they wiped out a large portion of their intellectuals. Watch out, USA, because I think that's one of the things. The dumbing down is one of the big things. But back to my parents' exodus from Germany. And my parents were married 32. I told you my oldest brother was born in 33. And my sister was born 2 years later. I don't know what the 2-year thing is, but and my other brother was born 2 years after that. But you've all heard of the Kristallnacht, the breaking of the glass, when Jews were picked up. Synagogues were defiled. My father was a farmer in northern Germany and was in his field in the morning after that night. And he was picked up by men who he knew, who he had gone to school with, because this was a very small community. I often think of it like Napoleon and that whole area down there where many people are of like culture, grew up together, married each other's sisters and cousins and all that sort of thing. And that was what's so difficult, is that these were people that my parents knew who turned on them. But he was taken to a facility in the nearby town where they had gathered the other Jews that night, mostly men. They did not, I believe, at least this is the way the story comes down to it, was mostly men in the family that were taken to oh, sorry, it gets a little emotional every once in a while. But they were taken to Sachsenhausen, which is a concentration camp near Berlin. And they were kept there for, again, family lore is mixed, but I've found some documentation that it was less than the 2 months that we were always told it was, to more like 3 to 6 weeks, where they were not, they were humiliated and made to do corporal labor, like digging ditches and those kinds of things, but they were not tortured in any way. It was a time when, as you have read, if you've read any of the fiction about this period, that they were trying to scare Jews out of Germany. They wanted to resolve the problem that way, and it sure scared my family into getting out of there. My mother had already tried to contact friends in both Canada and the US to see if they would sponsor them, because that was one of that was the gold card in getting out of Germany, is that, as you know, if you watch the Ken Burns series, the US only allowed about 200,000 Jews into this country. That was their quota. And that's huge when you think that 5 to 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. What a minuscule amount. And as the Ken Burns series showed so well, they turned people back often because that was the quota. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism within our State Department and government that thwarted many people getting saved by entering the country. Well, my mother apparently just got into searching down the right people that they knew who had immigrated to the United States. And one was a really nice man who had been the baker's son in their little village, shot by Marion Hoffa, who lived in Gordon, Nebraska. And he did enable them to get to this country. He had a job for them. He bought a ranch, which was a good investment for him, but it was a kindness so that my father would have a job that he was qualified for, because that was part of the price of admission, was that if your sponsor had to find you work. I guess we could find some parallels to what's going on with immigration in this country. We've got plenty of jobs. Why can't we fix the system to let people in? But we were fortunate. They were fortunate. So they arrived in near Thanksgiving in 1939, after having had to sell their property, because that too was the Nuremberg laws. Jews could not own property in Germany, and they sold it certainly at a loss. But my father's mother, his 3 sisters, brother-in-law, and niece and nephew, I would tell you, maybe I should tell you a little bit about these pictures, because what I find with so many people and the Holocaust deniers is that they can't make a tangible, they don't get a real sense of anybody who went through this. And so many of the survivors of the Holocaust or that era are gone. They don't know them. So to see the faces is what I'm doing with some of these. This is in Germany. Those are my siblings who were born there. And the youngest one is the only one still living. But it's my mother and father and my brother Nano, my sister Foley, my brother Gerhard, and that's my grandmother, who I never met. And these are my father's and mother's parents, my father's mother and father and their parents, all Jews: Sophie van der Waal, Jacob, Goldina, after whom I'm named, and Nathan, and then Sophie, Levi Schoenthal, and Simon Schoenthal. Yes. Yes, they were. They lived in a very small rural community that had been pushed back from the North Sea, actually. And our farm, the picture there, that farm was on an old dike, because you want to be elevated for when the waters, and it's much like what people perceive the Hans Brinker Holland looked like, flat with lots of canals. So, yeah, these were papers that related to the property sale and other legal documents that they went through, one of which is the one about another law. Another one of these Nuremberg laws was they could not employ, Jews could not employ non-Jews in their work. And on farms in those days, you always had help, someone to help in the house and workmen to help on the farm. And my mother had a longtime helper in her home who wanted to be with them because she was like a daughter, another daughter, and they were fined for having her in their employ. So that's one of the papers. But I thought the interesting part was to see the Reichs stamp down at the bottom. That's what you see in lots of documentation. The Nazis were in charge, and that was the stamp you had to get. These are the individual sisters, and this is very shortly before they were killed. I don't know, that's my grandmother, who looks a lot older than 66. But in showing you these, my father wanted my grandmother to come along with them to this country. They were going to make that work somehow. And he also wanted his sister's children to come with them. But they went into Holland, where my uncle had property, and that was where they were ultimately picked up by the Nazis. But they chose not to, because they thought, like, as history shows, Germans always went through tough times. They had moments where there were, I mean, in the Ukraine and other places, they called them pogroms. But in Germany, it was people just shunning them or going through difficult times. And Jews kind of got used to that. And they never thought that it would come to what it ultimately did. So, in just bringing this to, yes, I think so.
Go to the next.
Yep. And they were picked up in September of 1943, somewhere near Amsterdam. I think it was Leiden, is what Holland, if you've ever been over there, if you have a geography sense of where things are. But they were taken to Auschwitz, all of them. And a year later, in 1944, they were murdered. Yeah, these are not their official death certificates, but they are research after the fact, indicating when they died.
And this is the one that always really brings it home, because they look a lot like my niece and nephew.
So that's the story of why we're having this discussion today, because in about 2013 or 2014, this is the existential angst part of me. I had been a Republican all of my adult life. From my first campaign was the Goldwater campaign when I lived in Virginia. And when we moved to North Dakota, my husband was an FBI agent, so I was not involved in politics for a number of years until he got out of the Bureau. And then I became involved by being an office holder or appointee under several Republican administrations. I was always a social moderate because I was pro-choice. I felt it was important to take care of people who couldn't take care of themselves. But on economics and other policies, you know, it was the kind of thing, well, we'd pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, blah, 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 that old party line. But in about 2013, I saw a shift, a really dramatic shift to what had always been marginal politics. The John Birch Society attitude of finding somebody to point a finger at and hate. And it's, I don't know if they're interchangeable, but they're certainly related. The Ku Klux Klan mentality began to infect a lot of what was going on in mainstream politics, not just the peripheral. And it came to be more apparent when I went to my last Republican convention, when I was leading the charge against the heartbeat bill, which in essence was going to do away with women's rights to their own health decisions. And we were successful in turning that back in 2014. But at the convention, it was just such an environment of not collegial nature that it had been when I ran for office in 1996. I ran for a statewide office. Lost, but it was close. But there was just a whole different attitude becoming pervasive. And I started watching what was happening, and it was just finding things to pick that were not what we usually stood for. And when I saw that there was the whole immigration thing was being turned into a bugaboo, something to hate the other. I mean, there's always bias involved with people you don't know. And that's what Hitler did so masterfully. And what he once said was, if we had not had the Jews to hate, I would have had to invent someone. And that seems to be what we're doing in our society today, is we are finding people to point to and hate, be they are indigenous people, be they people of any color other than us, or in Germany's case, I mean, it wasn't just the Jews that were put in concentration camps. It was the Seventh-day Adventists. It was what they called the Romas, the Gypsies. Certainly people the first ones rounded up were the socialists, because they were pointing to the socialists and communists as the ones who were doing all of the wrongs and had created the problems of labor unions. And that was what Hitler's first roundup was to round up the communists and people they blamed as being socialist. And so, you know, and LGBT also. I mean, it was anybody who was of different, because they wanted a reine Rasse, a pure race was what they were aiming for. So my siblings were obviously, if they had stayed, which some of my mother's relatives suggested she stay with the kids, they would not have been spared. They would have been lost as well. So, because there was a percentage, I think they went, if you had both parents, and that was why I showed the picture of my father's, both sides of the family, was that if you were 100% Jewish, that your parents and grandparents had been Jews, you were 100% Jewish, and then it went from there to different percentages that some people got by not being Jewish. But I saw too many parallels, and I'll tell you, Betty, one of the things that happened just recently that I'm really actually proud of it, I wear it as a badge of courage, is that I was called by one of the, I don't call him a journalist, he's a blogger, and he said, discounted me as being supportive of Cara Mund, as a Republican supportive of Cara Mund, which I am. I encourage you all to vote for her. I know this is not a place to do that, but anyway, this Marnie says I've lost my filters, so forgive me that. But this blogger said, "Oh, she's not a Republican. She's been for all kinds of liberal causes these past few years." So I was discounted as being supportive of liberal causes. Now, if women's right to choose is a liberal cause, yep, but it used to be a conservative one. And if also looking for supporting ethics, the ethics initiative of the past few years, if that is a liberal cause, I'm proud of those two things, because both of them are about democracy. And if it's only liberals upholding democracy right now, we're in a mess. But we just have to work that much harder. So whoever's liberal in this audience, I'm with you. Yes, now I think we should open up questions, because I've just thrown out this whole family history within 10 minutes.
So I know there's been a lot of different things in the news, and some of this, there's a lot of things to say about that, but I think that what's really the crux of this is that idea that you're looking at erosion of democracy, and that's really the concern, and we hear that a lot in the news. And so if there's anyone who would like to comment, Stephen will help with that, and we can just talk a little bit. We have a good 10 minutes that we can do that. So please feel free to comment or share.
Hi. One of the things that I was struck by in that documentary was the fact that Adolf Hitler looked at our treatment of the indigenous people and the black people, the slavery, and he used that as his model for Mein Kampf, basically. He looked at it and he said, well, this worked for the, making sure the Indians were put on the reservations. And so everything he did about the Jews was basically based upon American European biases. And so what's really unfortunate about that is the fact that those biases have to be identified and understood. And right now, with the way people are trying to indoctrinate kids, so they're not learning about race, they're not learning about the LGBT community, they're being brainwashed into such a sad place where we always hope that the young people will be the saviors of us old people that made mistakes, but now they're being just as brainwashed, and it's an ignorance thing. And I'm really, I'm concerned about the democracy. Absolutely.
I think all of these tell-all books that are being written now about people who were in the Trump administration and are complicit with all of these things that have happened now because of the fear that was spawned, the tearing down of our institutions, be it education or government or law enforcement, the undermining of our establishment that happened over those 4 years and continues to happen with people believing this kind of propaganda. It has to be pushed back. And I am hopeful, Marnie and I had this conversation, is that talking about existential angst and being afraid that our young people will be indoctrinated into this. I think there is a silent group of people that have watched all of this roiling of politics and have come to the realization that fear that fear mongering and the undermining of institutions and blaming it on people is wrong, that they will stand up like they did in the last election, because Trump did not get a second term. So hopefully we'll see see good people doing the right thing, and that's what I truly believe will come out as we go into this next 2-year cycle, sad as everything appears to be right now. And I've got a grandson who's suddenly perking up and taking on his shoulders, getting out there and encouraging young people to vote and to be informed as they vote, not just to take it from one source. So I have to be, and there are other good things happening, young leaders that are stepping forward and speaking up, and they're not going to do it the way we did it, and that's probably a good thing. But we have 2 people that are, or maybe more than that, that have served on school boards in here. And that is going to be, they're in crisis with parents who want their children to be sheltered from anything awful, anything that would indicate that we weren't all white and right in everything we do. And that's offensive in so many ways, because this country is based on immigration and people who are different from one another, and that's what makes this such a wonderful quilt of democracy.
I am not as optimistic as you, and I just think we're up against something that we've never had before, and that's the media. And the media is so powerful that they are making people into cults, where if they said the sun is green, the people are going to believe it. And my son, I have 2 sons, one that follows everything that goes, the other is a philosopher and a very good Christian. And he studies history so much that he says, I'm not listening to the news. History just repeats itself. He expects, I imagine, America to go down like it has many countries before. And one Republican billionaire gave $1.6 billion for this election. I sent in $50. We can't compete because that money does turn out votes. And with Citizens United, which I think most of you are familiar with, Citizens United has destroyed democracy as well as gerrymandering. And you can get out the black vote, but they put them all in one little area, so their vote doesn't count like it should. So I'm glad for all the people that are optimistic, but somehow right now I'm not so sure.
Well, Lillian and I have had discussions, and I don't have anything to say counter to that, because in one of my talks when I spoke at BSC, so many of the patterns seemed to fit. Even the media thing was not there, granted, in the 1930s. But the complicit people to Hitler's rise were overconfident politicians, complacent bureaucrats, smug intellectuals with the complicity of a few greedy industrialists and oligarchs. And we can see the influence that they had in the previous administration, and they still wield it in doing the kinds of opposition and contributions enabled under Citizens United. But at the same time, we have to know that there are many democracy groups, and I became involved with some of those national democracy groups when we were doing the initiated measure to get ethics and transparency in government into our Constitution. And by God, that's an achievement when you look at the red state, North Dakota, that we got that through. Now, granted, there are still hurdles to go through, but to have that statement made, that's an optimistic step. But we became involved with a bunch of democracy groups on the national level. Some of them are more visible than others, but there are so many groups working. I mean, I get, I have to delete 92 requests for funds from many of these organizations every morning on my whatever feeds they are. But so they're out there and they are working hard and they have constituents. And there is the theory that if you can influence 10 people in your circle of influence, that you can make a difference in an election. You don't have to feel futile. Just get out there and make sure that people hear a different side of the story, that they will. And in my parents' case, people who were not supposed to have any kind of communications or socializing with my folks would bring them food in the night. The pastor of the church came and baptized my siblings in the dark of night. But anyway, we don't have to be quite that clandestine. But the message, make sure that you stay involved and don't give up.
I watched an NPR special called The Rise of the Nazis, and they it talked a little bit about the parallels between what was going on and you know, and then talked about the big lie. And then, of course, we've all heard that phrase being used about the stolen election, the big lie. And of course, in Germany, the big lie was demonizing the Jews. And I was wondering if one thing that I didn't see as a parallel, and I thought it was spooky because the next step would have been to declare martial law, and it would have been almost exactly the same. You know, and I kind of thought he might try to do that, but the one thing that I didn't see is in Germany the incorporation of that lie into their mythology about their nation and their nationalism and the purity of their blood, and I didn't see that here. And I was wondering if you might have a comment on that part of it, how important that might have been in Germany versus maybe not so important here.
Well, as I mentioned, I mean, there is this I shouldn't say mythology, but it was it's in all of their literature that you from olden days, way back when, there was also always the other, and it was always somebody who didn't believe the way the common Christian Lutheran way of living. And the churches were complicit. Talk about complicity in the rise of Hitler. The churches were complicit because the Lutherans obviously had their self-interest, and they had been preaching against the Jews, as did the Catholics, because they would always use it as Jesus was killed by the Jews, which our modern day evangelicals have taken up a notch to say that they are the actual Israelites, in that they are the chosen, right? And so it's, somebody made the analogy for me, and I am not an agronomist, but there are seeds that are deep in the earth that only come to fruition when the climate is right, and they have all things come together, and then they grow, be they weeds or something that has not grown for many, many years, plants of one sort or another. And that's, I think, how we compare these kinds of rises of hatred. You have to have the right climate and dynamic. And when people like our previous president studies this kind of craziness and brings it forth in so many, scratching at people's hatred or their bias or their they're just feeling badly in their lives, that's when that seed grows and flourishes. I guess the only way to tamp it down, again, is to speak truth. Speak truth to power, speak truth to those who take issue with honest discussion and a different point of view, and not shout at them. I think of this one guy, Herb, who keeps calling into Joel Heitkamp and has swallowed the Kool-Aid so to the point that he's just poisoned, because he will always come through with all of the reasons that Biden is bad, that what's going on in this world is misbegotten. And you can't convince them otherwise, because if they had to admit that they were wrong, they would have to admit that they had accepted evil, that they were wrong, that they embraced this kind of hatred and this kind of evil. And I don't know. I mean, that's uncomfortable. It's like having to say that what we believe in is all wrong and we have to accept that kind of bile. You've made too much of an investment in what you believe in. And that's why we sometimes can't get to the Herbs of the world. But there are a lot of good people who just need to see things into a perspective that they can. And I'm struggling with that, because I do know a lot of people who are good friends of mine that we don't even talk about politics, because they will still say, well, if just as our politicians that are running for office right now, when you ask them, well, if Trump gets elected again, would you, or is on the ballot again, will you vote for him? And after all that has been brought out in the January 6th hearings, after all the books that have been written from people within that administration, they will still say yes. And that's troubling to me. So anyway, I guess I've gone over what we're supposed to do in a place of worship. But it is very difficult not to tell this story of my parents' exodus without bringing up the parallels of today. And that involves the politics of today. So forgive me for that breach of your decorum.
I forgive you. All right. So just to close that on, one thing is that, in showing those faces of our relatives, one of the reasons that we do that is something that Mom taught me a long time ago, talking about in 2014 with the heartbeat bill, is that if you can get people to realize that they have something in common, even if it's relatives, people they loved, if you look at the faces of someone, a lot of times that's halfway to some kind of understanding that softens some of these hard edges of our lives. And so I think that is why this talk is so important, and to show the faces of those children who died and those great aunts who died. And they look like us. They are us. Those kids look like my niece and nephew. And if you don't see that and think to yourself, this could happen to someone I know, those look like people I know, well, then you're pretty lost. So I think telling those stories is really important. And I'm really grateful that Mom is telling those stories. So thank you for being here today. And thank you for listening. And so at this time, we're going to extinguish the chalice and have one more piece of music, our sending music from Alicia. But we'll extinguish the chalice with these words: "Wherever we are, love is," by Deborah Hoffner. As we enter another week of uncertainty in the world, let us remember that there is only one side, that of humanity and planet Earth. May we pray for peace. May we raise our voices with our elected officials and engage as we can in acts of resistance. And may we remember to take very good care of ourselves, each other, and those we love. May we remember these words adapted from the Unity Prayer. The light of love surrounds us. Love enfolds us. The power of love protects us. Love watches over us. Wherever we are, love is.